Over 100 years ago, tanks rolled onto the battlefields of the First World War for the first time. It was a revolutionary weapon. The steel track-driven behemoths were designed to overcome the enemy's trenches while protecting their own crew from the enemy's cannon fire.
What the tank brings, it's what every soldier's always wanted through history. It's about mobility, it's about some form of weapon, the firepower, and some form of protection. And even an infantryman with some body armour on, they're all the things that they want. What the tank does is it does it at speed, and it does it in a sort of an enlarged manner. So in a sense, it's boiling down an essence of the military that's been around for a long time.
Malwinkel in Saxony-Anhalt. On a former Soviet military base, army tanks are rolling on peaceful missions. Driving a tank has become recreational pastime. 12 years ago, people established a tank driving school here. The vehicles are from the inventory of the GDR and the former Warsaw Pact.
First of all, when they arrive, they've demilitarized, which means they have huge holes in them. We are allowed to patch them with standard sheet metal, which means we can weld them together with much thinner material. And then, of course, they look really bad. Once they are welded, they are sandblasted, then painted again, and minor repairs are performed. You never buy a finished, perfect product, but they have been discarded from an army somewhere.
It is almost exclusively men who succumb to the fascination of tanks. The decommissioned war equipment has its own very special charm.
Anyone who has a bit of a feel for technology is fascinated by tanks. The power, the military strength. No matter whether you're militaristic or a pacifist, it's just impressive. And, of course, the noise and this monster-like appearance are really impressive.
After a short introduction, the student driver is allowed to put the tank, which was developed in the Soviet Union, in motion. Later, they receive commands from the driving instructor via the so-called tank helmet. The 200-hectare site is an adventure playground for adults, with vehicles designed for destruction. That's what makes it so attractive.
You can still see them live here, not like in a museum. You can touch them, hear the sound. You can also experience the feel and what it's like to be driving a chunk of armor with the earth trembling, and that it is incredibly great when you sit behind the wheel and you proudly operate it yourself.
The Czech infantry fighting vehicle with a weight of 13 tons and 300 horsepower is one of the lighter examples. Other models weigh up to 50 tons.
I still know how to drive a good old Trabant, but a tank doesn't drive like that. It's completely different, because everything is so slow. Fortunately, you drive 3 laps, and during the second lap you slowly get the grip, and by the third you understand how it works. In the beginning you just lurch back and forth, but then it works, and then it's even more fun.
Tanks made their first major appearance over 100 years ago in Cambrai in northern France. It was on November the 20th, 1917, that machines fought against machines for the first time. Cannons against steel colossuses. That battle in the First World War was the first major tank offensive in the history of mankind.
This battle at Cambrai demonstrated the true effectiveness of tanks. However, there were enormous losses. After 2 or 3 days, only about 50 of the initial 350 tanks were able to continue fighting.
For the first 2 days of the Battle of Cambrai, it's seen as a great success. For the first time in the war, the church bells are rung in England to announce a success. So this is considered the sort of saving moment for the tanks.
At the time, the front lines between Germany and France had been mostly at a standstill for more than 3 years. Millions of soldiers had been killed in pointless trench warfare. By using tanks, the British offensive hoped to break through the German positions.
The British tanks reached their final destination, but were completely burned out. The same gains they made with the tanks the Germans got back in a few days with their foot soldiers. What the British achieved was that they had saved blood. They had made those gains with less loss of life, and that is the essential lesson from Cambrai.
For the Germans, Cambrai is important because, first of all, it was a bad wake-up call for them. After Cambrai, it was clear that the tank would be a key weapons system.
Ideas for armored vehicles had been floating around long before the start of the First World War. Gunther Bursten, an Austrian army officer, developed the first plans for a modern all-terrain battle tank as early as 1911. His motor gun, however, was never built. The groundbreaking idea of the continuous track belongs to an American. Holt Caterpillar had been manufacturing heavy agricultural machinery in the US since the 1890s. The vehicle's rotating track ensured that the machines could move better over unpaved terrain. At the beginning of the First World War, his tracked vehicles inspired a British officer named Ernest Swinton. He advanced the idea of using armored tractors from Holt as combat vehicles. However, this attempt failed. It was the then naval officer Winston Churchill who was so convinced of the idea of armored land ships that he set up a special committee for their development. The Landship Committee.
Churchill has seen the benefit of armoured vehicles, and he starts pushing the Royal Navy to try and create something that, even at the time, they were calling it a land battleship. And the army says, if we're going to build something like a tank, it's not called a tank yet, it's going to have to cross a 6-foot wide German trench. It's got to have certain characteristics. They end up putting these ideas together and they come up with a prototype. The prototype is called Little Willie.
Little Willie was the first roadworthy tank in the history of warfare. It was ready for testing by the end of 1915. After modifications and the construction of a second prototype, Big Willie, with a completely circulating track, serious production could begin. The first operational tank, which would later become the Mark I, was born.
The British rolled the first tank onto the battlefield, and this fact has secured them a place in the history books, so to speak. The first tank was British. The fact is, however, that the French, as an armoured nation, were at least as important as the British throughout the war.
France. The small town of Saumur lies a good 300 kilometers southwest of Paris, in the department of Maine-et-Loire. Besides a legendary castle and its wines, the town on the Loire is famous as a former training center for cavalry. Today, the French Ministry of Defense maintains one of the world's largest tank museums here, the Musée des Blindés. Outside, steel witnesses of 2 world wars. With more than 800 exhibits, the museum commemorates military conflicts since the invention of the tank. But the discarded steel behemoths are not intended for disarmament. They will be restored and made roadworthy again. The specialists are working on a German Panzerkampfwagen 5, a model from 1943. The so-called Panther was fast and powerful, but its engine often had problems.
The engines used were often ship's engines, so they were very large, because you needed an enormous amount of power for the drivetrain.
Lieutenant Colonel Garnier du Labarrière is curator and head of the museum.
It's definitely more complicated than the American engines. You can see why they lost the war.
The museum's director is particularly proud of a French model, the Renault FT. It's one of the most successful tanks from the First World War. He also restored it from scratch. 80,000 visitors come to the museum every year to see combat vehicles like these.
Just because something is frightening doesn't mean you can't be interested in it. Sometimes evil is particularly attractive. People often say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And these machines of destruction, when they were in use, might trigger a certain fascination among the visitors. That's why they come to the Tank Museum.
Even the small, compact Renault FT is still roadworthy. From Saumur, it is on loan in Paris for a special mission. It is intended to commemorate France's tank-building tradition at an armaments fair. Its career began in the First World War. At almost the same time as the British, French military engineers had been working on armored combat vehicles. After first attempts with large, heavy models, they developed the light all-terrain Renault in 1916 and ordered 3,500 of them in 1917. A mini-tank barely bigger than an automobile.
I've always admired the pioneers very much. The Renault FT light tank is an exceptional tank, especially because it's the first one, with all its strengths and weaknesses, which made it possible to develop the current, more powerful tanks.
Only 2 men are needed to operate the Renault FT. The commander sits directly above the driver and transmits his signals by foot. A tap left on the shoulder means drive left. A tap on the right means drive right. And a tap on the head means stop. But as simple as the communication in the vehicle is, the rest of the vehicle is just as ingenious.
It's a light, fast tank, mass-produced, and it has a difference. It's got a turret. Not all tank models had that until then. And here, the French industry also found a bit of a place for itself and went in a direction that was really groundbreaking.
Before the first British tanks were completed in 1916, soldiers for the new weapon had to be found and trained. This proved to be difficult, as very few men had experience with motor vehicles, let alone the technical know-how.
The tank troop didn't yet exist as a kind of weapon, but volunteers were sought, and these volunteers were drafted from the entire army, which was actually a relatively wild bunch. There were probably very few people who could actually drive a car, But that was no problem. These vehicles were so simply constructed. I think it was more demanding in 1914 to drive a horse-drawn carriage than to drive a tank. It could be learned.
It was a new system. There was a weapon with which one saw a chance to win the war, to win the battle as well. It offered potential protection, and there were things like better food and more holidays. And there was also the possibility of potential advancement with the new weapon, so there would be promotions and medals. Those were the motivations the soldiers had.
The German soldiers were completely surprised when, early in the morning on September 15th in 1916, a vehicle rolled out of the fog towards them. It was the first tank attack in world history. The steel colossuses rolled over grenade funnels, barbed wire and trenches, and couldn't be stopped by machine guns or hand grenades. But the tanks were not invulnerable. For the tank crews, it was barely tolerable inside.
They are terribly cramped spaces. You have the engine right in the middle. Once the engine runs for about half an hour, the exhausts that run up to the roof, they glow red hot. So it's a very hot space. There is no suspension, no springs at all on the vehicle. So everywhere you go, you're going to be flung around the place all the time. The engine also leaks carbon monoxide into the cab. So what they found during the course of a day's battle, the crew were quietly getting poisoned.
This sometimes meant that the crews had to stop, that they'd pass out, that they had to open the hatches to ventilate the cab. They could hardly see. They could only see through very small slots what was going on outside.
You couldn't communicate with each other. You had to yell at each other, to really scream in their ear, and even that often didn't work out. All in all, it was a completely impossible work situation.
You could almost say it's the forecourt to hell inside those tanks.
With the appearance of the British Mark I tanks on the battlefield, a new era began in the history of warfare. Although neither the French nor the British succeeded in changing the front line on that day, the new weapon had a great effect. A shock for the German soldiers.
We have reports in the sources about the first tank attack that show that the soldiers didn't understand what was rolling toward them.
You could imagine that it was like some sort of extraterrestrial thing rolling towards them, and it was farm boys from the rural areas who could not figure out at all what was coming their way. But at the same time, it was clear it was attacking them and trying to kill them. It was unstoppable. And an important psychological aspect of it was that this rolling, the tracks that were rolling towards you, threatened to roll over and crush you. It's a very violent psychological thing, the unstoppability of this malicious object. And this is also the point. It's an object, a machine, something soulless. That really shocked a lot of soldiers at that moment.
Not only were the simple soldiers shocked by the tank, but so were the commanders-in-chief of the German army, who hadn't expected the effect of this new miracle weapon.
A tank shock took place in the military leadership as well as the political leadership, because now there was something new, and in this war it was rather unusual that the opponent came up with something that was not available on their own side. So of course this immediately triggered activity as well as unrest on the German side.
In the First World War, the Germans repeatedly captured British tanks that had broken down or had been shot. The hijacked vehicles provided important insights into their opponent's weapon technology. The tanks were used by the German military not only to help build their own tank forces, but also as a source of ideas for technical developments.
By the autumn of 1917, they had a relatively large number of British tanks, so why not just rebuild them? Probably because they had already started building their own.
As early as November 1916, the Supreme Army Command had developed a German tank. The result? The A7V, a mighty 30-ton steel colossus driven by an 18-man crew. Maximum speed, 16 kilometers per hour. Only 20 of the 38 Sturmpanzerwagen, which were originally ordered, were built. There wasn't enough steel to build more.
The Germans had no access to the world market as a result of the blockade that had been placed around the German Reich. That meant they had precious few raw materials. They could have put iron and special rare metals and so on into the tanks, but the same raw materials were also being used for submarines, and the submarines were already an established weapon.
Back then, armaments always meant having to choose between different options, because resources were of course not unlimited, and armor itself was not a priority in 1917 either, because the tank had not been a success story until then.
But in England, where the citizens made a decisive contribution to the financing of the new miracle weapon through war loans, its use was celebrated with euphoria. The British felt technologically superior and declared the use of the tank a success.
The tank becomes a huge propaganda success in Britain, and the British public sort of fall in love with the tank. We end up in Britain, there's a dance called the Tanko. You could buy a handbag for the ladies shaped like a tank. All sorts of things were going on to celebrate the fact that we had this new special weapon.
The British, like the other nations, were of course under the impression that the war that had become so bogged down was hopeless. And the tank, whether one knew of details or not, offered at least the promise that there would be some means of ending this war. It wasn't that important if it would really work. You had something to believe in again, a focus of hope.
They then take tanks round to all the British cities to help raise money for the war effort. And they get to the point one city's rivaling another with how much money they've made.
The tank became a hit.
The symbolic power of the tank depends, of course, on the outcome of the war, so it's very different from country to country. For the Germans, symbolic power did not develop at first. The Germans built a few tanks and used a lot of captured ones, but there was never any real tank enthusiasm in Germany.
The horror of war had deeply buried itself in the hearts of returning German soldiers. They had all risked their lives. The massive experience of violence had shaped them. Only a few of them had gone up against tanks in battle. Toxic gas, severe shell splinters and scrap metal injuries had left traces on the body and soul of the man. The doctors had never seen such terrible wounds. Many soldiers suffered from sleep disorders, panic attacks or paralysis. But not all men were visibly wounded. At the time, neurologists considered the soldiers' symptoms to be weakness of will and effeminacy. The only aim of their treatment was to get them back to the front line as quickly as possible. But the men couldn't overcome the tank shock.
We know that many soldiers said it was especially bad because this machine seemed so soulless. You can understand a human opponent. The other soldier, he's like you. That also makes it harder to kill him, but at least you understand him. The machine, however, is cold. It's unstoppable and aggressive.
A war triptych by Otto Dix. Like many artists, he volunteered for the front in the First World War. But the reality of the trenches quickly disillusioned him. He captured in pictures what he experienced on the battlefields. He drew and painted what war does to man. The only artist who captured the new wonder weapon in a picture was an Englishman, the war painter Christopher Nevinson. The War Propaganda Bureau had sent him to the Western Front in 1917 as an official war painter. But he too not only celebrated the new propaganda weapon, but also captured the downside. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the First World War ended on paper according to international law. Further development of the tank was controversially discussed by the Allies. The English and French scrapped some of the thousands of tanks they produced and used the steel for civilian purposes. The Germans had no choice. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited them from developing new weapons.
In the interwar period, this led to the fact that the Germans, first of all, had an extreme focus on tanks when they saw that the others had something that they no longer had. They had forbidden it to us. Therefore, it had to be important. So this Versailles effect did not lead the Germans to say, well, it's forbidden to us, we no longer have to deal with it. It was exactly the opposite. Because it was forbidden to them, they focused on it intensively.
They mounted wooden and sheet metal armor on cars and did maneuvers with them. The German military intensively studied British treatises on the war. Their aim was to test new strategies for the future use of tanks. While England and France were disarming in the 1920s, the Reichswehr was already training for the next war on that model.
The Germans tried to keep up with the development of mobile warfare, even though they had no tanks. The thought was always that tanks would one day be really reliable and fast. And that was in the mid-1920s, when the technological development was already so far advanced that it was foreseeable that they could cover long distances on the battlefield. They would be able to act autonomously, and somehow you had to get a grip on that. You had to write down the rules of the game. You had to get into the heads of the soldiers, and that's why they built these dummies during maneuvers to do a flanking maneuver and to surprise a battalion or a regiment that practiced from the side. That's exactly what tanks did in the Second World War, fast flank movements into the side of the opponent, and the young soldiers of the Reichswehr had that ready. They were used to it by using these dummies.
Hitler in particular saw the tank as the weapon of the future, and in 1935 openly continued the hitherto secret armament.
In the 1930s, after Hitler took power, and with the rearmament of the Wehrmacht, the situation shifted. That's when the tank became a central weapon of the Wehrmacht.
By the beginning of the 1930s, German companies had secretly resumed the forbidden production of arms. Companies such as Daimler-Benz, Krupp, MAN, and Rheinmetall. It was lucrative business for the privately organized defense industry in Germany. They built the tank combat vehicles 1 and 2, light tanks, 6 to 9 tons heavy and based on the French Renault FT model, the one equipped with a turret. Serious production began in 1937.
The first German tanks, which were already being built from 1933 onward, were vehicles where the main thing was to produce as many as possible, as quickly as possible.
zu produzieren.
In the Soviet Union, tank production in the 1930s was based on the same principle. Industrialized armament began when Stalin seized power. After the dictator had carried out his relentless purges within the party, he then took on the Red Army. He had countless leaders eliminated, replaced them with compliant successors, and massively expanded the armed forces. The Red Army grew from around 600,000 soldiers in 1930 to just under 1 million in 1934. Stalin also advanced the production of armaments, especially tanks, thus further expanding his power apparatus.
In the Soviet Union, a combination of several factors came together that quickly made the country one of the most important tank builders and tank utilizers. Basically, the communist ideology loved the machine, so all mechanization was good. That is why the communists also paid very close attention to tanks, because they said, that suits our way of thinking, that's what we want. The whole thing was then underpinned with the ideas of Stalin, with the rapid industrialization. As a result, the Soviet Union, he captured in pictures, suddenly built more tanks in the 1930s than all the other nations put together.
Viel mehr Panzer baut als alle anderen Staaten zusammen.
With the Wehrmacht's attack on Poland on September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler unleashed World War II and justified it with a lie.
Auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
Only a few months later, in May of 1940, Hitler gave the order to attack in the West. Blitzkrieg was what German propaganda called the war plan with which the Wehrmacht overran the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France in just a few days. Completely by surprise, German tank divisions invaded the forest trails of the Ardennes, which were considered insurmountable. The fast pace of advance and the good interactions of the tank troops helped the Germans to break through.
One of the key things for tank crews is that sense of fighting together. You're a team. You've got to be effective as a team if you're going to be successful in battle. There is that claustrophobia, that sense of you're going to know the guy who's sitting with you, what he had for breakfast. So that sense of you're all in it together and you rely on each other if you're going to be an effective tank crew.
In contrast to British and French tanks, German tanks already had radio communication. A decisive advantage in tactical maneuvers. The vulnerability of the tanks in combat was the same on both sides.
Soldiers in tanks know best how vulnerable this steel box in which they were sitting is. On the one hand, it was of course very nice to have armoured steel around you. That was reassuring. Then again, you were of course a large block of steel driving on the battlefield, and both sides knew, both the tank crew and the defending crews with guns, that you had to be eliminated. That is, one was protected on the one hand, but at the same time one drew fire on oneself.
Everything depends on the type of grenade and where it hits the tank, and from what distance it is fired.
Although the Allies had more and sometimes better tanks in the Western campaign, they could not stop the German tank divisions. There were losses on both sides, and it quickly became clear to all involved the tank is not only the new miracle weapon, it also quickly becomes a death trap.
If you're hit, is to get out of that tank quickly. They're trained to actually evacuate a tank in 3 to 5 seconds. If you were penetrated and the engine caught fire, one of the major issues is not just the petrol, but it's also actually setting fire to the ammunition. And the last thing you want to be is in a tank if it's set on fire. I spoke to a veteran once and he said we could hear another tank crew, their radio was on send when the men were burning, and he said after that we went into action with our pistols on our laps because we certainly were never going to be in a tank that was burning. We'd rather shoot ourselves.
This fear was intensified by the fact that the soldiers could see practically nothing. One had side slots, one could look out, but of course they mostly only gave you a very narrow field of vision.
To be protected as a soldier and at the same time to defeat the enemy ranks quickly and forcefully, that was the promise of the tank in the First World War.
The fact it's got that firepower and shock action as it's going forward as well, that really brings something new to the battlefield.
By the beginning of the Second World War, at the latest, the firepower of tanks had become the decisive characteristic of the steel weapon. Larger cannons with more range and penetration were used. Tanks were particularly successful if they did not lose mobility and armor despite their firepower. In the Swiss canton of Aargau, almost 150 kilometers north of the Swiss capital of Bern, lies the small municipality of Fulreuenthal. Here in the Tank Museum, a special myth is brought to life. A German King Tiger tank from the Second World War. One of the few still existing German main battle tanks, the Tiger II. Up till the end of the war, only 492 units were built. Since 2007, a team led by Christian Hug, historian and a professional officer in the Swiss Army, has been restoring the legendary supertank from the Second World War in his spare time. Their goal, to make the Tiger optically perfect and technically fully functional. At the end of the restoration work, the Tiger should again be ready to drive.
It is a kind of conveying history in order to actually confront people with history, that one makes history experienceable to a certain extent, as far as one can. To read in a book how a tank worked is one thing, but when you then see one in front of you, hear it, feel how the ground vibrates when the thing comes driving by, that leaves a completely different impression.
A second cannon supplies the spare parts of the 8.8 centimeter original cannon, the most powerful tank cannon in World War II. Screws no one has loosened since the war.
There are hardly any spare parts left. Certain parts, which were standard with all German tanks, were the same. For example, lamps and instruments can sometimes still be found. And with certain parts, which really no longer exist, we have to find originals in other museums, where perhaps by chance the one part is still preserved, which has been missing or was in a poor condition. Then one can take measurements, and that actually allows you to reconstruct one that is true to the original again.
In the spring of 1942, the Tiger first entered the prototype stage, here on a test track at the vehicle manufacturer Henschel. Until then, the Panzerkampfwagen 1 and 2 were the backbone of the German divisions. They were especially fast. But Hitler demanded tanks with greater penetrating power and commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to develop a supertank. The Tiger, Hitler's prestige object. Thick armor and a large cannon should make the vehicle particularly strong. The Tiger I quickly became a myth, With only about 1,300 manufactured units, the heavy main battle tank's reputation already preceded it.
If the opposing soldiers saw this distinctive shape, they knew what was coming, namely not any German tank, but this very heavy, very powerful and very difficult to eliminate Tiger tank, and that had a very negative psychological effect on the opposite side. There are reports, and they are credible, that tanks, medium tanks, withdrew when they recognized a Tiger rolling towards them, which was reasonable.
Accordingly, German propaganda used the supertank for its own purposes. Pretending there were thousands of them when there were none was part of the program. Scarcely 500 copies of the Königstigers were built between 1944 and 45.
The Tiger is a classic symbol of power. German propaganda is obviously, it emphasizes the mechanized part of the German military. So let's look at our tanks, let's look at our aeroplanes. What German propaganda doesn't always do, of course, is wait for the rest of the German military to come up the road. You know, 80% of German transport in World War II was still on horseback, and we tend to forget that. But of course, the propaganda will emphasize the latest equipment, such as Tiger tanks, and it also tried to build up heroes for the German people.
German propaganda exploited the successes of the Wehrmacht in a film. It presented the French campaign as a motorized Sunday drive accompanied by a tank song. In the film, General Guderian's tank divisions are described as the spearhead of the German military.
A single tank is very difficult to use as a propaganda object, but the NS propaganda used the tank weapon as a whole, that is, the performance of the tanks at the front, very strongly as a propaganda medium. Because tanks always have this fascination, which the NS had for modern and antiquated things. They had modern weapon systems, engines, gears, cannons, everything very progressive. And ancient, this war elephant, the fighting pig.
The King Tiger in the Vollreuenthal Museum arrived in Switzerland from Germany or France after the end of the war. It is on permanent loan from the Swiss Army. Its history is largely unknown. The men only know that their copy was delivered to the German troops in September of 1944. Original plans no longer exist. A lot of detective work and ingenuity are necessary to restore the Tiger to its true original state. Technical solutions have to be found by trial and error and manual dexterity. The hinge of a hatch is stuck. Heat should make the steel flexible again.
What fascinates me is, of course, the legend of the almighty Tiger. But also there's the technology, because that's a Maybach engine. And if I'm correct, it was actually a racing engine or an aircraft engine. And how they put it in a tank like that with all the technology and the transmission linkage, I find that fascinating, especially for back then. Today you have systems for customizing and CAD. Back then, everything was created with drawings. Yes, it was impressive.
The work on the Panzerkampfwagen 6, the King Tiger, which was considered invincible, is also educational for another reason.
If you see what the tanks looked like at the beginning of the war and what is actually inside this vehicle, you can see all the basic features of modern battle tanks as they are still used today and which were actually already inside here.
In July 1941, the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union with a total of 3 million soldiers and around 3,600 tanks. At that time, Stalin had the largest tank army in the world, with around 20,000 combat vehicles. But the Soviet tank soldiers were less well trained, and in the first months of the war were defeated by opponents who were tactically more experienced. The Germans advanced without opposition.
The warfare in the Second World War with tanks changed the moment when the tank became mechanically more reliable. It could drive much further, it could drive faster, it could drive more reliably. This meant that the tank division had to carry everything with it, so that it could really operate far on the battlefield, 50, 200, 300 kilometers ahead. And that meant it also needed trucks or armored infantry fighting vehicles and so on. That happened in 1940-41 and changed warfare, because now it was possible to suddenly cover long distances again, fighting, forming cauldrons, making flanking movements, everything that was typical in the 19th century of cavalry with long marches. It had ended in the First World War, but then it was possible again.
An ace in the Russian dictator's sleeve was the T-34, an extremely powerful vehicle that the Germans had not expected. That Soviet tank quickly became a fearsome opponent. In the summer of 1941, it was considered the best tank in the world.
The T-34 is interesting because it completely escaped German discovery until Germany invaded the Soviet Union. It was a disaster for the intelligence services.
After the German invasion, Stalin moved the tank factories in the west behind the Urals. Production of the successful T-34 model was steadily increased. With over 50,000 units made, the T-34 was the most mass-produced tank of the Second World War. These combat vehicles left the factory in ever-increasing numbers and provided supplies for the Red Army.
The T-34 tank starts losing things during the course of the war, just so they can make more of them quickly. They look crude, but they're effective. Perhaps the best analogy is the Russians in World War II looked at a T-34 tank like we might look at a hand grenade. It's a munition that's usable almost once, and then we get another one.
Hitler's planned lightning campaign against the Soviet Union turned into a murderous war of annihilation that lasted for years. By 1943 at the latest, the German defeat in the East was sealed. The Soviet campaign marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War.